Andrew Rimby is a PhD candidate and queer activist at Stony Brook University, researching 19th century literature from a queer transatlantic perspective. He is the 2019 inaugural recipient of the Giuliano Global Fellowship, a 2019-2020 Public Humanities Fellow, and a 2019 Stony Brook Graduate Fellow in the Arts, Humanities, and Lettered Social Sciences. With Adam Katz, he co anchors The Ivory Tower Boiler Room, a podcast about navigating academia during the pandemic. His article on teaching Whitman during the pandemic is about to appear in 19th century gender studies. He is also the associate editor for the Watchung Review, hope I pronounced that right, and a board member of the Walt Whitman Initiative. And Andrew is here today to help us take a closer look at both Walt Whitman and another Long Island poet, William Cullen Bryant. So take it away, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And hi, everyone out there. I first just want to express my gratitude to the Port Washington Library, celebrating 2 years of collaboration. I can't believe it's been 2 years. Thank you to Jeff. Also for this talk, my work with Cynthia Shore, who is the executive director of the Whitman Birthplace, who kindly lent me her Bryant and Whitman notes for inspiration. And my new collaboration with the Friends of Cedarmere. Hi, I see some of you out there from the board, and the Nassau County Museum of Art. And then I have acknowledgements later on, including some links to what is now the published article. It actually just came out a week ago, so I can share it with all of you. So today I'm going to explore Whitman's literary relationship with William Cullen Bryant. It will be mostly heavy on poetics, so a few close readings of Bryant's poetry that Whitman was imitating and inspired by. So I do have a warning, there will be close reading of naturalist poems. So I hope you're ready, it's in the title. But I do want to foreground the talk with a brief biographical sketch of Bryant before he met Whitman in 1846. I'll return to the key term transcendental in my title. We're not there yet, so we don't have to put our literary terminology hats on for genre just yet. But how did William Cullen Bryant make his way to New York and eventually Long Island? Because he did not start in New York. So William Cullen Bryant was actually born near Cummington, Massachusetts in 1794. He was the second son of doctor and state legislator Peter Bryant, and Peter Bryant's wife was Sarah Snell. Both of their ancestors, they were passengers on the Mayflower, so we are talking a very settler colonial family. At 13, Bryant actually writes his first poem. It's called The Embargo. It's a satirical poem that calls for the resignation of President Thomas Jefferson. It is eventually published in 1808. Bryant started his literary career very early. At 16, Bryant enrolls at Williams College, which is still going strong. He eventually actually wanted to transfer to Yale, but was unable to. But he stayed at Williams. He writes Thanatopsis, which is probably, I would say, his most well-known canonical poem when you think of William Cullen Bryant. Thanatopsis, quickly, Thanos is Greek for death, opsis, sight, seeing. Eventually, it does get to mean spectacle in dramatic terminology, but Bryant meant this term to combine a consideration of death. And now that I've given that all out to you, we're actually not going to closely read Thanatopsis, but I recommend you read it. It is a really well done poem. So while Bryant is, even though, like I said, he's unable to attend Yale, he still studies law under private tuition. He's admitted to the bar at the age of 21. He spends 10 years practicing in Massachusetts. And during this time in Massachusetts, he meets his future wife, Frances Fairchild. They're together for 50 years. In 1821, he's asked to speak at Harvard's commencement. And it's during this time that he starts to publish his first book of verse. And it's the 1820 period that we'll mostly be looking at in terms of what poems Whitman is most inspired by with the themes of nature. Okay, so here's Bryant's move to New York. Why does he move to New York? Well, in 1829, he moves to New York City to become the editor of the New York Review. Later that year, he then becomes editor-in-chief of the New York Evening Post. So the New York Evening Post will be really key, especially for why Whitman eventually meets Bryant. He holds this position as he dies and resides in Roslyn until his death. He uses the newspaper as a call for the abolition of slavery. He's an advocate for Abraham Lincoln and makes that very clear as editor-in-chief. And his tie to the New York Evening Post also allows him a platform for his poetry, and also ties him to the Hudson River School of Art, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. We'll actually see, I keep teasing you all with what's to come, but we'll see one of the Hudson River School paintings where William Cullen Bryant actually makes an appearance. So, like I said, William Cullen Bryant is editor of the New York Evening Post for about 50 years. It's one of America's leading newspaper publications during the 19th century. And while he was a lawyer at the first part of his life, he eventually just turns full-time to being the editor-in-chief because, you can't do both of those careers at once. So as editor-in-chief, what was he actually publishing in the editorials? Well, he was publishing goings-on in New York City. Like I said, he does publish a lot of pieces about abolition. I will return to that because it will be this divergent pathway between two major American poets of Long Island, but also just of the 19th century. And here enters Walt Whitman. So let's leave William Cullen Bryant in his 1820s editorial position where he's starting to publish a lot of the naturalist poems that he starts to become really well known for. Walt Whitman, born in West Hills in 1819, to Walter Whitman and Louisa Van Velser, both from farming families. Walter is from a farming family in West Hills, Louisa from a farming family in Cold Spring Harbor. Interestingly, Walter Whitman, like William Cullen Bryant's parents, has that the white settler colonial ancestry of coming to New England in the 1600s. Louisa Van Velser is not from a Protestant family. She's actually from a Dutch Quaker family. And that will become important, especially when I talk about William Cullen Bryant's home, Cedarmere, and what actually existed at Cedarmere before its occupation as a country estate by Bryant. So Whitman moves to Brooklyn in 1823. He moves there because his father anticipates this housing boom in Brooklyn. However, it doesn't really manifest as a boom. So the family is constantly moving between different Brooklyn homes that Walt's father is constructing. However, Walt continues to return to Long Island to visit his grandparents who still live in the West Hills area at that time. He goes to the Long Island Sound a lot for inspiration for his poetry. Again, I'll return to that later on when he talks about visiting Greenport, but also when Roslyn is brought up by Walt Whitman. In 1836, Whitman actually starts to become a school teacher on Long Island. And he's 17. He moves from Brooklyn back to Long Island. He teaches at, and here's a lot of names, East Norwich in the spring. He teaches in Babylon in the fall. Then he teaches at Long Swamp. Then he teaches at Smithtown. And there's many more that I'm not going to name, but he does have a stint in Woodbury, and there is a very satirical piece of his where he condemns what he calls, quote, damned Woodbury. I always feel really bad saying that because I know there's probably those who live in Woodbury, and I think it's a very beautiful town. So I'm not going to follow Whitman on that train of thought. But he also teaches in Queens. He jumps around to many different towns. Because at that time, it was very common for a teacher to only be employed during a season, kind of similar to how universities run on a semester. He actually leaves teaching in 1838 to start the Long Islander in Huntington. So if you had come to my talk last, which is on YouTube, I had talked about Whitman in Huntington Village, and that was all about him creating this weekly newspaper, the Long Islander. However, he only stays there for 10 months. He is not quite on time to arriving at the newspaper. Not very good at a 9-to-5 schedule, which makes sense for a creative type. So 10 months later, he sells the Long Islander. He starts the Long Island Democrat. Doesn't start it, but I should say he starts a writing job there. And the Long Island Democrat then was in Jamaica, Queens. So we're left with Whitman at the Long Island Democrat, and of course, William Cullen Bryant. It's the 1840s, but Bryant is still with the New York Evening Post. However, in 1843, Bryant purchases Cedarmere. And I'm going to return to this later on. I have a lot to talk about with Cedarmere and its history, but not yet. I just want you to know, 1843, Bryant is now living in Roslyn Harbor. Whitman is now back in the city. He's back in Brooklyn. Bryant, though, has to continually do the commute from Roslyn Harbor to New York City to help with being the editor-in-chief of the New York Evening Post. Whitman and Bryant actually meet when Whitman is editing the Democratic Brooklyn Daily Eagle. So he's no longer with the Long Island Democrat. He only stays there a few years in Jamaica, Queens. He's now at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which if you ever have a chance, you could see its old stomping grounds. It's right where the Brooklyn Bridge is in Brooklyn Heights. That's actually where Whitman publishes Leaves of Grass in 1855. And I'll plug it. 99 Ryerson Street is the home where Whitman is when he publishes Leaves of Grass. So I include later on a link to the Whitman Initiative. They're trying to preserve that home. Okay. So after Whitman and Bryant meet, when Whitman is editing the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and there's not much conversation that Bryant or Whitman have about the actual meeting. However, it must have gone well enough because during the summer of 1851, Whitman publishes 5 articles in the New York Evening Post. And I'm going to actually discuss some of those articles later on when it follows the timeline. So, you know, a few questions I want to keep in the ether is, why is Bryant so important to the young Whitman? Is it because Bryant, like Whitman, has this dual editorial job and is balancing a job as a poet? So is it a blueprint for Whitman to follow? I'm going to leave that out there for us all to think about. In 1847, I know I'm throwing a lot of dates, but I like to contextualize. Whitman calls Bryant, quote, one of the best poets in the world, end quote. So many of Whitman's early poems, they echo Bryant's early work. So I said I'm not going to read Thanatopsis, but the first poem I'm actually going to turn to, let's see, there you go, is actually Whitman's poem. So this was a recently rediscovered poem called To Bryant, the Poet of Nature. It is an honorific poem, meaning it honors William Cullen Bryant. In 1842, Whitman actually writes this. So Whitman has not even met William Cullen Bryant yet. Remember, that meeting does not happen until around 1846. However, Bryant is extremely popular, and some would argue probably the most popular 19th century American poet published in the middle of the 19th century. So I'm going to read the poem. To Bryant, the poet of nature. Let glory diadem the mighty dead, let monuments of brass and marble rise to those who have upon our being shed a golden halo borrowed from the skies, and given to time its most enduring prize, for they but little less than angels were, but not to thee, oh, nature's own. We should, when from this clod the minstrel soul aspires, and joins the glorious band of purer lyres, talk columns build, thy monument is here, forever fixed in its eternity, a monument God built. 'Tis seen around in mountains huge and many gliding streams, wherever the torrent lifts a melancholy sound, or modest flower in broad savanna gleams. Okay, that's actually Walt Whitman writing that poem. So there's a lot of imitation of Bryant going on with the verse. This is actually a rhyming poem, which, if you know Whitman, is very unlike Whitman, who is known as creating free verse in the 19th century. Now, if he actually created free verse or not is debatable, but honoring and basically putting William Cullen Bryant into this monument-like ancient Greek tomb. There's this very classic trope going on that Whitman is trying to imitate. And this was not the first time that Whitman imitates this type of, what I'll eventually discuss, has a very romanticist theme going on. Whitman's early poetry is known for being very sentimental. It is an experiment with 4 or 5 line stanza poems. They all have regular meters, just like this poem. They have rhyming verse. And that eventually Whitman abandons. So, Bryant is so important to Whitman, though, that he starts to craft and experiment around Bryant's verse. Okay, so you might be asking, what does Bryant's verse look like if you've never read William Cullen Bryant? Well, I have a close reading poem. This is called To a Waterfowl. And so To a Waterfowl is actually written in 1818. Bryant is about 24, and as these literary coincidences tend to happen, guess how old Whitman was when he met William Cullen Bryant when he was working for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle? Well, I'm giving you a rhetorical question, so I hope you all are shouting it out there. He was 24. I love how these literary relationships work. So Bryant is 24 when he writes To a Waterfowl. I'm not going to read it all, but I do want to read the first stanza to give you that, what Bryant was honing in on when he was writing his verse. Whither, midst falling dew, while glow the heavens with the last steps of day, far through the rosy depths, dost thou pursue thy solitary way? Vainly the fowler's eye might mark thy distant flight to do thee wrong, as, darkly painted on the crimson sky, thy figure floats along. Okay, so has this, very back and forth rhyme. The sing-songing nature is present here. It's easy to recite, which was important in the early 19th century poems. So, use this poem as a good way of testing your memory. Of course, I have our first picture of Cedarmere, then called the William Cullen Bryant Homestead. It still looks like this. I'll get into talking up Cedarmere soon, don't worry, when I actually show you what it looks like in its current 2021 vision. But I just imagine To a Waterfowl. Bryant wasn't living in Cedarmere yet. This is much earlier than when he resides there in 1843, but it makes sense that he would choose this country estate to inspire his poetry, which is why he said he moved there, to try to embrace that naturalist side of his. Okay. And there is Cedarmere in February 2021 when I visited, and you can see it was during one of those intense snowstorms. So Cedarmere, probably right now, I'm imagining, just has all of the blossoming going on. So, well, I say that, and I know some of the Cedarmere board members are here. So hi to especially Bob Sargent and Ned White, who I've been exchanging emails with, very kind. They wanted to just let you all know that Cedarmere now is actually owned by Nassau County, and people are welcome to visit the grounds at 225 Bryant Avenue. William Cullen Bryant is present everywhere in Roslyn, in all different namesakes. The Bryant Library, there's signs about where Cedarmere is, so Bryant has a long-lasting impression in Roslyn, and so he shall. At this time, they reminded me Bryant's house and study, where he wrote many of his poems, they're not yet opened, but walking the ground offers ample rewards. The grounds are open to the public. It's easy parking. I've been there many times. I will be there again soon. And I'll talk more about that when I leave you on the cliffhanger of this two-part discussion. Okay, so to a waterfowl, I just want to read the end so you have in your mind, and we're back into Bryant's poetics of naturalism. So, he who from zone to zone guides through the boundless sky thy certain flight, in the long way that I must tread alone, will lead my steps aright. So, zone, alone, flight, aright. Right, a nice A-B rhyme scheme. If I was having my students do that as a lesson, it just sticks in your mind, right? We really can imagine the waterfowl. And it has, Bryant is really tuning into that romanticist theme of choosing one animal, or it's very Keatsian, of focusing on one object or focusing on one animal to just honor throughout the poem. Very unlike Whitman, except for that poem I showed you where he does just that by holding up William Cullen Bryant. Okay, another very powerful poem of Bryant's that really continues to show how he's reckoning with nature. It's called Midsummer. It is from 1826. When I was reading it, was thinking about the Nassau County Museum of Art and their grounds, because it's actually part of the Nassau County Museum of Art is called the William Cullen Bryant Preserve. And there's all of these hiking trails, and I will show you a little of what that looks like to just bring the nature to life. So that was my inspirational photo. I guess I'm doing a little imitating of Bryant in photography. So I'll read Midsummer. It's actually a very short poem. A power is on the earth and in the air, from which the vital spirit shrinks afraid, and shelters him in nooks of deepest shade, from the hot steam and from the fiery glare. Look forth upon the earth, her thousand plants are smitten. Even the dark sun-loving maize faints in the field beneath the torrid blaze. The herd beside the shaded fountain pants, for life is driven from all the landscape brown. The bird hath sought his tree, the snake his den, the trout floats dead in the hot stream, and men drop by the sunstroke in the populous town, as if the day of fire had dawned and sent its deadly breath into the firmament. There's quite a turn in this poem. So while I'm on literary terms, that would be called the volta. The volta is a turn in poetry with its theme. So what does seem very idyllic soon turns deadly. The trout is floating dead in the hot stream. Men are dropping by the numbers because of sunstroke. maybe not quite what should happen as you are relaxing among William Cullen Bryant's idyllic Cedarmere. So, however, I want to bring this poem to attention because I do want to explain. It's not like Bryant is always writing these idyllic scenes of utopianism. There is horror in some of his poems. So he is playing with this binary, especially in Midsummer. However, we're now back into utopia in The Gladness of Nature from 1832. I also wanted to plug these. I love these images of America. I know there's one for Port Washington. There's one for Manhasset Bay. This one is William Cullen Bryant's Cedarmere Estate. And just to read the first stanza of The Gladness of Nature, just so you know that Bryant hasn't lost touch with personifying the beauty in nature. We're not always in the midsummer deathly sunstrokes. Is this a time to be cloudy and sad, when our mother nature laughs around, when even the deep blue heavens look glad, and gladness breathes from the blossoming ground? Very conventional. We have a rhetorical question asked. We have the personification of Mother Nature. There are notes of joy from the hangbird and wren, and the gossip of swallows through all the sky. The ground squirrel gaily chirps by his den, and the wilding bee hums merrily by. The clouds are at play in the azure space, and their shadows at play on the bright green veil. And here they stretch to the frolic chase, and there they roll on the easy gale. It continues. There's a dance of leaves in that aspen bower. There's a titter of winds in that beechen tree. There's a smile on the fruit and a smile on the flower, and a laugh from the brook that runs to the sea. And look at the broad-faced sun, how he smiles. On the dewy earth that smiles in his ray, on the leaping waters and gay young isles, I look, and he'll smile that gloom away. I just love reading it because you can hear the sing-songiness. You can almost anticipate the next line because of the rhyme scheme. I really appreciate the personification of the broad-faced sun. Interestingly, Whitman, if you've ever read Song of Myself, has a lot of lines about broad-faced. So even though he might not be eventually, and I will have us read, his later poems that do not take up this exact imitation of Bryant's rhyme scheme, he does have a lot of lines of broad-faced. So the poet continues to inspire Whitman, even in future lines where he's writing in free verse. And this talk, I really am, I'm not accusing Whitman of plagiarizing, but imitation does start to border on a type of plagiarism, not a plagiarism where you're going to be sent into suspension, but one where you're so inspired by a poet's verse that you're borrowing their lines, or you're borrowing certain phrases, which we all do as writers. It's that culture of inspiration. Okay, I had to show a photo of Bryant's statue at Bryant Park. Here it is in the springtime. If you've never seen the Bryant statue, it's right behind the William Cullen Bryant, well, actually the New York Public Library, and right in Bryant Square. Okay, so we are now into Whitman. And I beg the question here, is Whitman a romanticist? Is he a transcendentalist? Is he a naturalist? The categories could keep going on and on. It's complicated. I borrowed that from a lot of relationship profiles. It's complicated. So Whitman's poem that, for me, I think most resembles him imitating Bryant, but him doing it in free verse, is When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. It comes in 1865, and it's right at the cusp of the end of the Civil War. So I'll read it. And I also want you to know this beautiful statue of Walt Whitman that is at the Walt Whitman birthplace. And you can also visit the Walt Whitman birthplace right now as well and tour the grounds and tour the house as well, where Whitman was born in 1819. So here is when I heard the learned astronomer. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them. When I sitting heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. So the speaker is not impressed with the lecturing going on in the confines of the university, which is always a sad line for those of us who are Whitman scholars to read, but I tend to think that he would really love this type of talk right now going on with him and William Cullen Bryant. But it's in the actual night, in being surrounded by the stars, that the speaker gains his inspiration. Okay, so very conventional as a transcendentalist type of poem. Okay, you might ask, what is transcendentalism? I have a nice definition for you all. So transcendentalism usually, you tend to equate it with the 19th century movement in New England. It's America. So this is the American definition. I should preface it by saying that Ralph Waldo Emerson espouses, that Henry David Thoreau practices, and it's loosely bound by this idea that there's this idealistic system of thought where there's this whole unity that creation's involved in, that the innate goodness of humanity is tied up in. And it puts insight and experience over logic. So what Whitman is doing right here does follow that type of transcendentalist theme, where it's not in the lecturing, it's not in the charts, it's not in the diagrams, it's actually in going out into nature and seeing it for the speaker's self to be inspired, and looking up in perfect silence at the stars. We just saw William Cullen Bryant do that in The Gladness of Nature. However, I'm curious for all of you out there, do you think Whitman is a transcendentalist? It's a very debatable topic because this poem might follow a transcendentalist theme, but does that make Whitman a transcendentalist the way it makes Henry David Thoreau a transcendentalist who, you know, writes about his time in isolation in by Wadden Pond? I'm curious. There's a lot of different perspectives. However, I do want to take up the next definition, which is Whitman as a romanticist, which is a little different than a transcendentalist. Okay. Yep. Okay. Well, to exemplify the idea of romanticism, I'm now showing you one of those Hudson River School of Art paintings where William Cullen Bryant is depicted. You could try to zoom in. And he is, of course, distinguished, dapper. He's on the left-hand side. And he's shown in Asher Duran's 1849 Kindred Spirits. I couldn't find if this was exactly supposed to exemplify Hempstead Harbor. I like to think that maybe it's a representation of Hempstead Harbor. And the way that Bryant is depicted is very contrasting in the way Whitman presents himself. If you've ever seen the 1855 photograph, it's called a daguerreotype. Whitman is in this workman's outfit, but also farming outfit too, with a hat around, and he actually has his whole body shown in the poetry. Usually, if you ever bought a book of poems, you can look at William Cullen Bryant as an example. You only see, basically, you see a zoom image. Actually, probably more like up here. You would see right from the chest all the way up to the head, because creativity and poetry is supposed to emanate from the brain. However, for Whitman, it emanates throughout the whole body. Remember, in Song of Myself, he says, quote, he is the poet of the body and the soul. Okay, well, I have to draw our attention to the 1860 and Paths Untrodden, because this is a real clear divergence away from William Cullen Bryant, not only because it's free verse, but because of its theme. So I will now read in Paths Untrodden. So in Paths Untrodden, in the growth by margins of pond waters, escaped from the life that exhibits itself, from all the standards hitherto published, from the pleasures, profits, conformities, which too long I was offering to feed my soul. Clear to me now, standards not yet published. Clear to me that my soul, that the soul of the man I speak for, feeds, rejoices in comrades. Here, by myself, away from the clank of the world, tallying and talked to here by tongues aromatic, no longer abashed. For in this secluded spot, I can respond as I would not dare elsewhere. Strong upon me the life that does not exhibit itself, yet contains all the rest. Resolved to sing no songs today, but those of manly attachment, projecting them along that substantial life, bequeathing, hence, types of athletic love. Afternoon, this delicious 9th month, in my 41st year, I proceed for all who are or have been young men, to tell the secret of my nights and days, to celebrate the need of comrades. I'm just going to take a water break. So, not only is this free verse, but what does the speaker find when in isolation, when among nature, among the trees, shrouded and hidden? He finds something about himself and in his soul, and arrives at a summation that it's here in this spot of isolation that he can now pronounce that he proceeds, he speaks for all who are young men, all who have had that secret in their nights and days, the need to come together as comrades. Yes, there's an erotic potential here. There's a homoerotic potential here. Athletic love. This isn't the first time Whitman has harkened back to ancient Greek ideas of warrior love, which is very common, especially if you've read the Iliad and the Odyssey. He speaks a lot about that when he talks about honoring William Cullen Bryant in To Bryant, the Poet of Nature, having that type of antiquity tomb raised for Bryant, not only an ancient Greek reference, but of course also an Egyptian reference to the tombs of the pharaohs. But it still does have that nature theme centered. So it's not like he's left what he's imitated from William Cullen Bryant. He starts to, the keyword is subvert, right? Turn on its head. He has some lines that we have seen before from William Cullen Bryant's poems. He has that language of bequeathing, of showing, especially in the previous one, standards hitherto published. Standards hitherto published, that is quite a 19th century poetic line. However, did we think that we would get from standards hitherto published to tongues aromatic to this very erotically charged line? Probably not. Not if we were reading William Cullen Bryant. However, I will let you know, I will return to a homoerotic connection that William Cullen Bryant has in his own family. But before I do that, and I'm We're about 10 minutes away from the end. So please, if you have any questions, I'd love to, answer them all. Put them in the chat. I want to show you, this is when I think I was there in February. Pandemic time plays tricks on you. But this is when I was at the Nassau County Museum of Art, and I discovered for the first time, I had been to the museum, but I did not know about this treasure trove of the William Cullen Bryant Preserve. And it is stunning. You're going to see Hempstead Harbor in my video. It's a short video. I'm a little out of breath. I took it on my cell phone, but I had to capture the moment. So I try to be a little punny too. I'm on the Hempstead Harbor overlook path, and I keep reminding myself that what goes up must come down. But in my case, what goes down must come up, just to make sure that I can get back up to the top of the hill. Okay. Yeah, that was definitely Andrew humor, if you know me. So, oh wait, we're gonna get it again. Actually, before I jump there, let me do, because I've tantalized you long enough about Romanticism. So just to have an idea that we're all adhering to with what is Romanticism, in the late 18th to the mid 19th century, Romanticism was really seen as a literary movement where you rejected order, you rejected calm, you rejected the idea of harmony, balance, idolization, basically anything that was seen as classicist, as trying to preserve order and idealism. Romanticism, as exemplified by William Wordsworth, he's probably the first who most of us think of when we think of Romanticism. When you look at his writing about Tintern Abbey, he's really laying out that ethos of trying to reject the categories of order and calm. So there's like a very quick, very Cliff Note version of what Romanticism is. So is Whitman doing that? I would say yes. Is he rejecting calm? Is he rejecting order? Yeah, he's creating something new. However, is it fully romanticist? Is it fully transcendentalist? I would argue not. I would say he's really starting to merge categories together. And like I said, there is this underlying current of homoeroticism, especially what he's doing here in Paths Untrodden. Okay, now the divergent paths of William Cullen Bryant and Walt Whitman. And yes, I did just make a pun about paths. It's so easy to do though. So in 1866, Bryant writes a poem called The Death of Slavery. Right, the Civil War has just ended, but Bryant releases The Death of Slavery in the Atlantic. And I just put out two very specific stanzas for us to look at, so we can understand how Bryant approaches abolitionism. Like I said, he already used the New York Evening Post as a paper to outwardly call for abolitionism, and also for suffrage, for the suffragette movement as well. So here are the stanzas. Quote, "I see the better years that hasten by, carry thee back into that shadowy past, where, in the dusty spaces, void and vast, the graves of those whom thou hast murdered lie, the slave pen, through whose door thy victims pass no more, is there, and there shall the grim block remain, at which the slave was sold, while at thy feet, scourges and engines of restraint and pain motor and rust by thine eternal seat. There, mid the symbols that proclaim thy crimes, dwell thou a warning to the coming times." Very powerful. A focus on the slave pen, the slave auction where slaves would have been sold, However, it's that last line that really stays with me, and I think is one that is something I would love to discuss in the Q&A. Dwell thou a warning to the coming times. This could come back again. This has not yet been finished, meaning slavery is not something that is now done away with. The idea of the harm, the trauma that has been done to Black Americans is staying with us. And how do we work through that? It's something that we are really looking at right now in 2021 with the Black Lives Matter movement. And also, what does it mean to have reparations? Bryant was actually talking about, and he does talk about the idea of reparations, not in the way we talk about it now, but you could, and I do interpret it as a warning to the coming times. What do you do when you have to think about race relations and giving agency to Black Americans? However, okay, so I'm leaving us there with Bryant. Whitman is a different case. Whitman is very complicated when it comes to the idea of even abolitionism. Whitman denies being an abolitionist in his writing. He actually says that he doesn't adhere to being an abolitionist, unlike Bryant, who actually is very vocal about it. In Song of Myself, there's that infamous line that the speaker states, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." Whitman and his legacy is a walking contradiction. This actually, and it feels very exciting, but also, it's a self-promotion of me quoting my own article, but I do talk about it in my article. In 1889, Whitman told his biographer, okay, well, I should preface. So 1889, Whitman dies in 1892. So this is on his deathbed, near his deathbed, as he's reflecting with his biographer on his life. He says to Horace Traubel, his biographer, that, quote, we, and I say settler families, all kept slaves then on Long Island. He acknowledges that his family cemetery in West Hills includes unmarked graves of the people in his family enslaved, of Black Americans. And this quotation, it really does foreground this whole contradiction about Whitman's vision of democracy. What do we do with those who say Whitman is a poet of democracy when he comes from a legacy of slaveholders, of those who took land from Native Americans on Long Island, specifically the Matinecock Tribe? He uses the term Pomanock, and I will mention that. Pomanock is an Algonquin term that means land of tributes. I could go more into it if you're interested in the Q&A of exactly what that tribute looks like. There's a lot of history behind that. And I actually get into that in the article too, of the Matinecock Tribe especially. Like, why did they talk about Long Island as a land of tributes? It has a long history. So Whitman also openly, at the end of his life, a lot of this really does come out. His quotes come out in the 1880s. He says that he doesn't know if abolitionism, if it should have happened the way it did. He was very against William Lloyd Garrison, who you would call a radical abolitionist, meaning it needs to happen at all costs. There's a really good book right now called The Slave's Cause. I quote it in my article. It's all about the history of abolitionism in America, and it looks at all of these different angles. Really well done. Lavelle Porter, who wrote an article called Should Walt Whitman Be Canceled?, also has a quote that I want us to reflect on. But there is no better place to look for nuanced critical engagement with Whitman's complicated legacy than in the work of Black intellectuals who have talked back to Whitman. So in a way right now, this is a certain talking back. And it's not like though those who talked back to Whitman's idea about slavery were only those who came after him. I've shown you William Cullen Bryant had a very different way of approaching slavery and being an open abolitionist. I do want to pose a question here. I'm not going to answer it because I don't think I have an answer. But William Cullen Bryant, Walt Whitman, from two settler families. However, William Cullen Bryant goes to Williams College, studies to become a lawyer privately, has a lot of funds, is wealthy. There's no denying that. Walt Whitman, from farming families, is able to eventually buy a house in Camden, New Jersey, a row home. However, is Walt Whitman as wealthy, I'll pose it, as William Cullen Bryant is? I mean, I think the answer is definitely no. Walt Whitman does have a settler legacy, but the way he even views Roslyn is very different. And I'm going to actually bring that up right now. Okay, so this is where I leave us all in suspense for the next talk, where she's already made an appearance. I'd like to think of these three authors, William Cullen Bryant, Walt Whitman, and Edith Wharton, who, when you think of the Gilded Age in New York, Edith Wharton comes to the forefront. So let me just talk about what does the Gilded Age mean. The Gilded Age is used a lot. There's a new HBO series coming out soon. They're currently on Long Island filming, so there's a lot of buzz. The Gilded Age comes from Mark Twain's novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. It's a satirical novel. It's Mark Twain, so it has to be. It's set in the late 1800s. It's used to describe the period right after the Civil War. And like we know, historical periods don't have a definite end and beginning. But it's usually known as marking the end of the Civil War after 1865 and moving to the turn of the century. Now, does it move to 1910? You know, is the Roaring Twenties the extension of the Gilded Age? There's a lot of ambiguity about that. But for my purpose, I'm really curious about this late 19th century ending. William Cullen Bryant dies during the Gilded Age. Walt Whitman dies during the Gilded Age. Edith Wharton is born during the Gilded Age. So all three of these writers in New York are basically a triangle of the Gilded Age. And I put Walt Whitman in the middle because it's Walt Whitman's imitation of William Cullen Bryant, but also his honorific poem, his fascination with Bryant's themes that, you know, really starts to get him percolating with thinking about how he's going to write a naturalist poem. And we see he starts to take it into a very subversive thematic when he writes in Paths Untrodden. Edith Wharton, this is my teaser, will eventually take up that call, but most specifically in writing that we don't look at. Edith Wharton's poetry. She starts to write a lot about how much Whitman is giving her inspiration when she writes about the body, when she writes about sexuality, when she writes about womanhood and what it means to be a woman who's full of desire. That does appear in her early novels. I'll read you one quote that I'm going to start my June talk with. And I love The House of Mirth, so I have to read this. Quote, and as Lily stared at the breathless suddenness of the suggestion, she continued with her easy laugh. You don't know them, and they don't know you. But that don't make a rap of difference. They've taken the Van Austen place at Roslyn, and I've got carte blanche to bring my friends down there. The more, the merrier. So Roslyn makes an appearance in Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth late on in the novel when Lily is about to have sudden turn of events, shall we call it. So she's going to summer at one of the Gilded Estate mansions. For Walt Whitman, here is the quote that I really want to read about Roslyn, because I think it also brings us to the end of just thinking of him in this contradictory way, but in a productive way of thinking about him as a poet of contradictions. So I'm not saying, I would never say throw Whitman out with the baby with the bathwater. That's a very mixed metaphor I just gave us. But this is the quote I'm really curious about. In 1889, Whitman again is talking to his biographer, Horace Traubel, and he says, "We all kept slaves then on Long Island." So I had read this part, but this is what he goes on later to say. "The legislature then had passed some graduated emancipation bill, something of that sort. There was considerable feeling at the time. All were not agreed in favor of it, but my folks were emancipationists. It was to cover a term of years. Finally, however, there came some decree of absolute emancipation, though I do not know that it was needed, as is apt to be the case in matters we know must take a stated course anyhow." So he's conflicted about the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation, predominantly. However, he just talked about this whole legacy of slavery, the idea of emancipation, and what comes to his mind right away? Horace Traubel narrates, he says, "Tension has relaxed, the hold taken off." So Horace Traubel is even noting this is a very tense conversation he's having with Whitman. Horace Traubel was an open abolitionist. Also, which is, I want to note, because this is Jewish American Month, Horace Traubel was a German Jewish settler to the Philadelphia area, not always known. So Whitman spoke of Long Island, of Bryant's home, a beautiful place, somewhat cliffy, rather cliffy. Of old it was called Mosquito Cove, but when the wealthy New Yorkers came along there with their handsome stately villas, Mosquito Cove had a plain rude sound, which they changed to Roslyn. So Roslyn means Roseland. There's no sign of liberty yet. Okay, so Whitman is now waiting for a visitor. So in Whitman's fashion, he goes from this topic to topic, but I want to end us with the way Roslyn is captured in Whitman's imagination. For William Cullen Bryant, it's in the way Bryant's friend, Eliza Seaman Leggett, who is a very predominant abolitionist and suffragist, also in the New York area from the 19th century. And she actually starts to write letters to Whitman. And she says, "I hope you are in good health this lovely day of October. I feel lonely in October since William Cullen Bryant died." This is right after William Cullen Bryant dies in 1878. "Always in this month I used to write to him. I remember the sweet October days in Roslyn when he and his wife would come over to Hillside, a Gilded Estate, on some soft dreamy afternoon in the Indian summer, perhaps with a small basket with nice lunch in it and a book, the Berkshire Jubilee, and he would climb up the hill and get into the woods, always stopping upon the brow of the hill back of the barn." Okay, she keeps going on, romanticizing the beautiful cliffs of Roslyn Harbor. And even Whitman's mother, Louisa Van Velser, writes to him before she dies about how beautiful Roslyn is. And for Whitman, though, yes, he does say Roslyn is beautiful, but he brings up how it was originally called Mosquito Cove, and how there's now this imbalance of the very privileged and those who are not able to live that utopic, idealistic life. So again, a contradiction that Whitman brings to mind. On that note, I know I covered a lot. I'm really excited to read. I saw there's a lot of questions. So thank you all. And I am going to stop my share. and get to see you all.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. I once again enjoyed your presentation. So much to take away from it as well. Before we do get to some of the questions, I will mention that to be continuing our exploration here with Edith Wharton, it's going to be on June 11th at 12 p.m., which is it's a Friday. That this you'll be back, and we'll be continuing this exploration of the Gilded Age and Edith Wharton. I have a couple of things to mention, but let's get to any questions that there may be. Bob, do you have some questions there?
I don't, Jeff. So maybe they're all on your end.
Okay. So one of the questions that the use of the natural world as inspiration, I'm guessing, is just a piece of artistic creative history. But what is it about these two poets that you feel are sort of illustrative of that kind of concept of using nature as their inspiration?
It's a really good question. So the question is, why turn to nature for just that poetic spark of creativity?
Yeah, absolutely. I just think there are examples of that, and obviously there's plenty of other authors and artists, creative types who have used nature. What's nice in this case, though, is that we can walk in their same footsteps, right, as you did, through those areas in Roslyn. So that's all. I was just trying to kind of focus in on the way that they not only use nature, but nature that we're all familiar with.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. There's so many different answers that a scholar would have about this. So my own answer would just be that nature, I know I didn't read this quote, but it's something that it stuck with me. Where did I write it? Yeah, because actually some consider Whitman to be an eco-poet, which is now this contemporary movement about writing about ecology, writing about the destructiveness of nature, right? Not its utopic Wordsworth idea of nature always being bountiful, but what do you do when nature is under attack? And Whitman does look at that side of nature being barren, or the speaker not feeling inspired by nature, right? In Paths Untrodden, the speaker is not gaining a utopic view of himself. The speaker is actually starting to become doubtful, which isn't exactly what is supposed to happen in Transcendentalism. You're not supposed to necessarily find something that you critique about yourself, that you are you're leaving the reader in a lurch. And that's not the traditional convention. And there's actually a lot of discussion right now from this website, Book Riot, which I really like. It does a lot of these contemporary book reviews. And it says that nature poetry is currently having an identity crisis, meaning in 2021. And I would agree. I think it's really difficult because of the ecological movement right now and what's happening with the climate. And how do you present a bucolic setting when you know the reality? And for me, Whitman is better to turn to for that question than Bryant. Bryant is, adhering to more of these traditional conventions of honoring, right? And there's nothing wrong with it, but just honoring that, waterfowl. Like, what's so beautiful about the fowl flapping its wings and flying in flight? And it always puts you on a high. There's always this type of, I feel like I'm flying with the muse. With Whitman, you usually don't feel like you're flying with the Greek muse. You feel like there is an identity crisis in his later poems. And I also, I just realized I didn't share, I could leave our questions on this last slide. I got so excited about The Gilded Age. But no, I have a list of just thanking and acknowledging all of my sources. And actually, while the conversation's going, I can put a link to my PowerPoint in the chat too, just because these are really great resources. And there's a link to my article. There's a link to a Bryant book that the Friends of Cedarmere recommended. Also, thanks to my dissertation director who's on here. Hi, Dr. Susan Shekel. And yeah, all of the organizations who have helped me with my own inspiration for this talk. And also that is the Bryant Library's historic room where all of William Cullen Bryant's, the collection is housed of his library. So I can stop the share, but I will put the link in the chat.
Yeah, you can feel free to leave it up if you like, so people can see those. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I do have a question. Please give us more information about the Minuet Native Americans and other Native Americans.
Sure. So more about the research that I've done with the Native Americans. Wait, sorry, Bob. Can you explain just like more of
the person? Yes, the person says yes. Your research about the Native Americans.
Okay. Thank you. That's a good question. So, I mean, in my article, I talk a lot about the Matinecock Tribe because the Matinecock Tribe, which I'm sure if you're a Long Island resident, you know the town Matinecock, that little small hamlet. I think it's a hamlet. I'm from New Jersey, so I know it's very specific. I don't want to get the town or the hamlet or the village wrong. But the Matinecock Tribe was actually the original settlers of the North Shore of Long Island, specifically the Huntington area, the North Shore of Nassau County, where Roslyn is currently, Port Washington, all Matinecock Tribe territory. The connection to the Whitman family is, I might get the great wrong, but basically Whitman's very early ancestor was connected to the Matinecock Tribe because in the late 1600s, one of the early Whitman ancestors had negotiated a trade and bought the land from the Matinecock Tribe for Huntington, not just him, but all of these early settlers in the Huntington area. However, I don't know if anyone's ever walked to Janes Hill, or if you've ever been in West Hills where the Peace and Plenty Inn is, the Joseph Whitman House. It's where all the Whitman ancestor homes are. Very hidden. It's near the Whitman Mall, but it is not next to the Whitman Mall. It's up on the hill. So there's a sign there that I actually bring up whenever I do a Janes Hill tour. And it says something like, this was a fort to protect against the Indians. Okay, the language is very problematic, but also my question has always been, well, what were the Native Americans trying to advocate for? And why were the settlers on this affront of having to create a fort? So obviously this was not a peace negotiation, and it might have something to do about the tribute status, which Pomanak means. So not only does it mean land of the tributes, it means negotiating trade with wampum, with shells, which wampum is a type of shell, but with bartering. I'm assuming the bartering did not happen, which is why a fort had to be built, because the settlers were starting to take over the land from the Native Americans. I hope that helps. I mean, and I should say, I'm not exactly like I know the Native American history through Whitman, so I'm not a Long Island Native American historian, but there's definitely a really good book that I have near me. What is it called? Oh, Tragic Encounters, which is the whole history of the Native Americans in the Northeast, which is really well done. Oh, and Native New Yorkers is another Native American book about mostly Long Island and New York City. I hope that helped.
Yeah, I think so. So we have a couple of questions here. This is actually from Ned White, who's with the Friends of Cedarmere. What role, if any, did the congested urban environment of New York City play as a counterpoint to the naturalism of both Bryant and Whitman?
I like that. It's a good question. Thanks, Ned. Well, for Whitman, it's interesting. For Whitman, it plays a really important role because he's always including the urban in his poetry collections. Like I read in Paths Untrodden, which is from Calamus, which the Calamus plant is this very phallic plant that's grown on Long Island and in New Jersey, where Whitman was, he was going to eventually settle in New Jersey. But he always incorporates the urban into these poems, right? There's Crossing Brooklyn Ferry is a really infamous poem where he does both. He talks about the swarms of people, but he also talks about finding yourself by yourself on a ferry. The speaker is trying to eventually journey from the multitude to the individual. For me, Bryant is not necessarily doing a lot with urbanism. Maybe I haven't discovered those poems, but it does seem he's much more interested in the solitude of just what's around, which is very consistent with Henry David Thoreau, with Wordsworth. I feel like Wordsworth and William Cullen Bryant play a really good back and forth conversation where Whitman is much more invested in that, the breaking point of what it means to be urban and what it means to be in the countryside. Yeah, there was a quote, I'll try to find it eventually, if I can find it here, where he actually does talk about, let me see. It talks about that exact point. Let's see, here it is. Yeah, when he actually is asked to write for Bryant in the New York Evening Post, in 1851, he writes about New York City, and he says, swarming and multitudinous as the population of the city still is, there are many thousands of its usual inhabitants now absent in the country. So Whitman was always interested in this, what we would call now the summer vacationers who flock to the Hamptons or the North Fork. Whitman was always in the North Fork. His sister, Mary, had married a shipbuilder in Greenport, so she had lived the rest of her life in Greenport. I always think of what would Whitman think of Greenport now, because it's very hipstery. It's definitely not quaint. It's become, if anyone's been there recently, it's a really brewery town. It's fairly cool. I love it. It doesn't have that quiet feeling. But yeah, he's always interested in the back and forth. He actually writes a lot about taking the train from Brooklyn to Greenport, which back then I think would have taken 5 hours with all the different carriages and stops. So a true day's visit. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
So another one here from Ned that connects a little bit with that, and then I'll come back to one more. Is there evidence of Walt Whitman affiliating with Transcendentalist figures in New York and or referring to himself as a member of the Transcendentalist movement?
Really good question. No, he never identifies as a Transcendentalist, which is why many would not call him a Transcendentalist. just because he doesn't self-identify. He's not really among the New England Transcendentalists. He does know Emerson. Emerson visits him in Brooklyn, is not impressed because he lives in a, not an apartment, but he lives in a row home. And he's not of the social class. Most of the Transcendentalists are like William Cullen Bryant, from very long-standing settler means of income. And they're college educated. Whitman is not college educated, and he's not even high school educated. So I think that's also kind of a breaking point. And why Whitman gets along very well with artists. He gets along very well with those in dive bars, or he's always in, there's a place called Pfaff's Cellar in Greenwich Village that Whitman was always at when he lived in the city. And that was like full of the theater performers and burlesque performers. It's hard for me to imagine William Cullen Bryant going to a burlesque bar. I mean, I don't think he'd be opposed to it. It's not the same social circle. Just like Edith Wharton. I don't think Edith Wharton is going to a dive bar.
Another question, were there Black leaders in the 19th century who talked back to Whitman about his views on slavery and abolition?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you for that. Well, he talks about Frederick Douglass. Whitman does not have very kind things to say about Frederick Douglass, which is, again, part of this. Some may say problematic. I just say reality of white Americans in slavery in the 19th century, which is he thought Frederick Douglass was an opportunist. He actually says something about Frederick Douglass, though, being very I don't want to misquote it, but he says something to the effect of Frederick Douglass is such a great orator. So he sees Frederick Douglass's potential and that he is a really well-spoken intellect and is doing a really good job spreading abolitionism. But then, right, he could have left it there at approving of Frederick Douglass, but then Whitman has where he digs himself in a hole where he says that Frederick Douglass has that kind of expertise because he has white blood, which is just very eugenic racist. It's a very Darwinian racist thought. Whitman started to really buy into Darwinian racism about evolution, which, unfortunately, he wasn't the only one in that period. But yeah, he doesn't talk about Sojourner Truth, which I find interesting, because even the white suffragettes, they're among Sojourner Truth. So they are, even, Susan B. Anthony, who has her problems on race, does talk about Sojourner Truth because she's with Sojourner Truth. I don't know if Whitman is actually, it's hard to find him among the Black intellectual community, which I think shows the problem there. The exposure isn't there. He does talk about a freed slave on the farm, which is, not quite an uplifting conversation, but I think shows what his family would, the legacy that the family had with slaves on the farm. That is a history on Long Island that I'm glad is finally a lot of scholars are addressing, because it wasn't just the Whitman family who were farming and had slaves. That was happening all across the island, except with the Quakers. The Quakers did have a very different stance on slave labor. And I wanted to bring that up. Cedarmere actually was a Quaker farm first in the 1700s. I don't know. I just think there's something very special about the Quaker heritage, the Quaker history on Long Island, and freed Black communities. Right, Hempstead is one of the first free Black communities, and right near it is a Quaker farm. It's not a coincidence. There was this kind of allegiance with each other, with the Quaker population and the Black American population. And I recently learned Freeport is named Freeport because it was a place for freed Black Americans. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Andrew. So I appreciate, again, terrific questions there. I really appreciate the fact that you certainly feel as if part of your role in your academic work is to just peel back those layers of history that are ones that have been glossed over, left out, unexplored, so that we can still continue to get right at the the truth of what our history is in this country. And I appreciate you taking that critical view. As Walt Whitman is held up as this poet of democracy, but there's a lot more to the picture, which I think you've helped illustrate today. The only other thing I wanted to ask about is just the way in which one creative artist affects another. You were showing how there was poetry of Bryant's that influenced Whitman's, that influences others, and you can see that certainly with artistic painters in the music world, etc. That it seems to be a it's part of the creative world. Is that we are, none of them are existing in a vacuum. That they are clearly influenced by their surroundings, by their environment, by their peers, etc. So I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, but that was certainly part of what struck me.
Yeah, I love that question, Jeff. I think it's who I am as a scholar. I do influence studies, where they call it reception studies, how an artist receives another's work. So yeah, Brian is influenced by Wordsworth. He's also influenced by so many other Romantic writers, and they're all influenced by Homer and the classics. And right, even though they reject categories, they don't actually not use those writers' work. Yeah, like you wouldn't have The Great Gatsby if you didn't have Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth or The Age of Innocence, right? You have to start to have those narratives out there. And no, they're all influenced. Like I'm influenced by so many scholars, but I'm influenced by all these writers. And I thank you for saying that about peeling back the layers, because when I'm teaching in the fall, I'm actually teaching The Great Gatsby with Nella Larson's Passing. And it's a very popular Harlem Renaissance novel. And it comes out around the same time as The Great Gatsby. And I think it shows you that other side of like, well, what is the Harlem Renaissance artist's life like during the Roaring 20s, which is kind of The Great Gatsby, right? There's the Valley of the Ashes. And I'm always curious, well, what's going on in the Valley of the Ashes? Like, who's working these homes? It's, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Oheka Castle, but this will always stay with me when I had gone to Oheka Castle to visit. Because I'll be the first to tell you, I love Gilded Age mansions. Like, I'm not, I buy into the beauty. I think it is. There's something to really learn about. Like, why is there such a fascination? And I learned that Oheka Castle, the Cold Spring Harbor train station, was built for Oheka Castle, which I didn't know, like that actual stop, because it's a mile away. And the servants could walk to the home from the city because they would take the train from Brooklyn and Queens. And, talk about a tale of two cities. It's, it's always been there. That exploitation, that it's always been part of this history. I think it's just whose stories haven't been told. You know, and I mean, it's exciting to see what kind of philanthropy is being done now with, I've seen it a lot with the Nassau County Museum of Art, definitely. And also Sands Point Preserve has done a lot of programming with, you know, what to do for the surrounding communities. Like that, they're broadening their audience. And I do think that that's important, and that it's so accessible. I mean, I was so surprised that I could go to the Nassau County Museum of Art and walk around for free. Like I thought I was going to be charged to do that. And even Cedarmere, that is open to the public, is incredible. It's, I would say it's exciting to see that that is happening, and that more voices are now present in those conversations.